Friday night. It's been several months now since we've been doing this because of COVID. And so we've gone through a bunch of different series. And this series that we're on now is spiritual abuse. And it's because a number of different people have asked me over the last 6 months to talk about this topic. It's one that is not talked about a lot because it's not the most common form of abuse, but in my work in complex trauma, I've come to realize there's a lot of people who have experienced spiritual abuse. And I felt it would be helpful to them to be able to have somebody talk about it in detail to help them really understand what it is, how it affects people. And to be very honest, I debated not doing the talk I'm going to do tonight because the whole premise of this, what we're talking about, is there's a type of spiritual abuse that basically is churches who take a subject that is really gray, but they turn it into a black and white thing, and then they scorn, look down on, judge people who don't believe the way they do. And that's what many of the people that I work with have experienced. They've gone to churches and heard these topics taught, and they go, I'm having trouble with that. And they present their feelings, and immediately they get shot down and told they're not a good Christian in so many words. And so part of me knows that in talking about this topic, I'm talking about some controversial but deeply emotional topics for a lot of people in churches. And they're going to judge me, and they're going to think I'm not a very good Christian because I'm challenging some of these topics that are such emotional hot buttons. But I decided to continue and do this talk because there's two other people, groups of people that I think will benefit from a talk like this. The first are people who are in churches that are overtly spiritually abusing people or subtly doing it. And something in them isn't sitting right, but they're told kind of to ignore that because this is what God wants. And I'm hoping it will help them begin to see, okay, I don't have to be going along with this. It's okay to disagree. And I hope it provides help for you in doing that. And then the main audience that I have in mind are those of you who've experienced this kind of spiritual abuse where you've disagreed with subjects that were made to sound black and white, but they're not really. And so what I pointed out last week is there's much of the Bible is about gray areas. And one of the things that has happened in many churches is that we've tried to make it a black and white thing. So everybody knows where they stand on this topic. But I pointed out that many godly scholars disagree on the interpretation of the Bible in these areas. And there are not some that are more godly than others, and that's why they disagree. It's very godly people who don't see eye to eye. And that should be a sign to us that, hey, then this is a gray area, and we need to be careful that we're not coming across as super dogmatic in these issues. We can express kind of how we see it and where we fall in the discussion, but to me, that's as far as we can go. And so I want to come at this again tonight and cover 4 more topics. But before we get there, I want to look at what is this spiritual abuse, just for some summary. So we're told, or I mentioned in the first video, that it's the result of a spiritual leader or a spiritual system who indoctrinate individuals and attempt to control or manipulate them through that indoctrination process. And so there's an element of coercion, there's an element of I'm here representing God, so you can't argue with me. To disagree with me is to disagree with God. So that can happen in a religious organization, but it can also happen in a home where you have one spouse spiritually abusing the other spouse, or you have parents spiritually abusing children. And that's where I would find a lot of people I work with have experienced spiritual abuse. And usually it involves misusing the Bible, twisting it, misinterpreting it. And usually there's an element where God, the God of the Bible, is seen as kind of angry God. And let me just talk about that. The common term is the fear of the Lord. And you're told you need to fear God. In the Hebrew world at that time when that phrase was used, the fear of the Lord, what it meant was a deep respect where you put more weight in that person's word because they were the most important person in your life. And so the fear of the Lord isn't about shuddering, afraid you're going to get punished. It's about a loving awe, admiration, respect for this person's wisdom and character for who they are. And so that phrase has been twisted to create, it's all right to create fear motivation in the people that we work with. I think it's important to also see that, and this might sound a little bit crass, but when you misuse the Bible and you kind of coerce people, there's an element in there of brainwashing. It could be overt, it could be very, very subtle. You wouldn't even necessarily see it as brainwashing, but that can be what this includes. Now, I came across a couple studies that I thought might interest you. So one study examined the correlation between a person's religious beliefs and their mental health. Now, this is very tentative as far as how dogmatic they can be with conclusions, but they thought that they saw that the God that you worship does affect your mental health. And so people they saw who had a angry God, a vengeful God, a God that they walked around afraid of all the time, versus a loving, benevolent God, those people were more likely to have mental health issues like social anxiety, paranoia, obsessions, and compulsions. And I found that very interesting. Then there's a lady named Dr. Marlene Winell who has coined a phrase called religious trauma syndrome. It is still somewhat controversial, but what she has done is study people who come out of cults, people who come out of very strict, legalistic, rule-bound, dogmatic, black and white churches, and they leave that. And what she saw is they were traumatized within those things. And so they have what she calls religious trauma syndrome. And so it's all about how does that affect a person when you've been immersed in that, when you've been brainwashed by that. And now you come out of that. So even though you have come to see that it is wrong, what they believe, these people still experienced fear, anxiety, flashbacks, nightmares, panic attacks, depression, and difficulty functioning in normal society and socially. And so often the people who come out of that, again, even though they rejected it, they still lived with a certain amount of fear that God might get them, that God might punish them for what they've done. And so she's just trying to establish that spiritual abuse in its most overt forms does have a profound, long-lasting effect on the people who are wrapped up in that. So let me come to the 4 things I want to talk about today that are topics that are controversial, very emotional, but not all Christians agree on them. But when you present them all as dogmatic, black and white, and somebody challenges you and is made to feel not like a good Christian, that can do spiritual abuse to them. So number 1, God rules everything. God is sovereign. God is in control. Secondly, if you live together with another person, you're sinning. Thirdly, God hates divorce. And fourthly, Jesus is the only way to heaven. And again, I'm not going to tell you what I believe. I'm going to present different camps to you and let you have more information to process through your own thoughts on this topic. So number one, God is in control. God rules everything. But what does that mean? And so Camp A would say, everything that happens in our world is God's will. Now, people I work with immediately would be offended by that. And they would say, do you mean that God wanted me to be sexually abused? That God could have stopped it and chose not to because he thought me being sexually abused was a good idea? I just can't accept that. Are you saying then that God is okay with sexual abuse? And sometimes it's his will for people to be sexually abused? I just don't then see God as a loving God. And so you can understand that. And then you hear stories where one person was sexually abused and another was somehow, God miraculously intervened to prevent it from happening. I've heard stories of Christians who were going on vacation and they prayed before they started out in their van or their car. And as they were going down the road, they had to stop because one of the kids had to go to the bathroom. So they took this unexpected stop, came back out and started back down the road. And there was an accident that had just happened. And they realized that if that child hadn't gone to the bathroom, they would have been in that accident. And they go, thank you, God, for saving us from that accident. But I've also heard of other Christians who prayed before they started out on their holiday, godly, wonderful Christians, and they got in an accident and all of their children were killed. And so you go, okay, so you're saying God stopped this one, but he could have stopped this one, but he didn't. Does that mean God plays favorites? Does that mean that God is kind of sporadic? And that just doesn't sit well. Now, some would say, in light of that, well, maybe then God wants to stop all those things, but there's another force stronger than God, and sometimes God wins and sometimes God loses. And so they go, well, that presents problems then if there's a force greater than God. And then other Christians would come along and say, no, here's how you resolve this in your mind. You just know that God is wise and that God is working out a bigger plan and that someday all of this will make sense. And that could be a little helpful to some, but still it doesn't get to the question of why did then God let me be sexually abused? Was that God's will that I be sexually abused? And so all of those things are the questions that come up when you listen to Camp A, that God is in control, everything that happens is God's will. So there's a Camp B. And Camp B says, God created the world, he put everything into motion, and then he just walked away. Like he wound up the clock and then he just left it. And some hold to that camp. And then there's a third camp that says, God is in control in a sense, and we don't fully understand what it looks like, but also humans have total free will. And so this is where it gets complicated. Because if God is in control, how can humans have free will? And if humans have free will, how can God be in control? They don't seem to be reconcilable. Because if God is in total control, then humans don't have free will. So let me just try to develop this camp a little bit for you because it's worth thinking through. So it's all about the challenge. If God created the world, he wanted a relationship with the people that he created, a love relationship. He loved them. He wanted to love them to love him back. And so the question is, how do you get people to love you back in ways that really are meaningful love? So God could have created everybody so they had to love him. They didn't have free will. They would be like a robot that just, I love you and I do whatever you want. But that's not meaningful love. Love is only meaningful when you have a choice not to love as well. So love is only meaningful in an environment where you have other options where you can direct your affections, and then you choose to love this person in light of all the options. And so people have to have free will in order to truly love, in order for relationships to be meaningful. But that opens up a hornet's nest. Because as soon as now you give people free will so that they can love, you also are giving them free will so that they can hurt others, so they can not love, so they can choose to do very self-serving things that use and abuse other people. But you can't have love without the other. And so that becomes the dilemma in this world that we live in. If God is this great God, but he wants us to experience love and the deepest joy in life, which comes from love, then we have to have a free will. And so this camp then brings in lots of different Bible parts to teach a doctrine that is called providence. And what that basically says is, without ever violating human will, humans can love or not love. They can abuse or be kind. And they can do all kinds of damage in society, and God is not going to intervene. God is not going to override their will. But somehow, in ways we don't understand, he's still able to carry out his ultimate goals and plans in the universe. And then the other piece that they bring in is Romans 8:28, where it says God takes everything that happens to you, good and bad, your choices and what others have done to you, and for those who surrender to him, he works it together to bring good out of it. So God takes the sexual abuse because he doesn't intervene and prevent it from happening, but he's committed to take that event in your life, and if you work with him, he will turn it into growth and into positive. And so that is how that works out. So again, you can see we can't fully understand that. That's beyond the ability of our little brains to get figured out. But if you go through the Bible, there's evidence of God doing that kind of thing. So that is the first one. The second one, living together versus marriage. So in my work with people who come out of not church backgrounds always, but just come out of this whole world, secular, however you want to call it, they would say to me, this marriage thing where you have to have a marriage ceremony, that just doesn't make sense to me. They say, I know people that have a marriage ceremony. They're not intending to stick with this person. They're not committed. They're just doing it to legalize sex, or they're just doing it to please their parents, or they're just doing it to get a whole lot of money from all the showers and everything. There's not a commitment there. So all of the emphasis of Christians on a marriage ceremony, that just doesn't make sense. Because even a lot of the Christians they know aren't getting a marriage ceremony done for the right reasons. And then they'd say beyond that, if you look at people who have a marriage ceremony versus who don't, their success rate's about the same. So having a marriage ceremony doesn't make a marriage successful. And so they just have a lot of problems with all of this emphasis on you need to get married. And so let me get you to think about that, because there are different camps amongst Christian people when it comes to this topic. So Camp A is you're only married if you have a legal marriage ceremony. And therefore, they would try to make the Bible say that you need a marriage ceremony or else you're not married in God's eyes. But others would disagree with them. Camp B. Now, you need to understand that what Camp A would like to say, because Camp B would say you don't need a formal ceremony. Camp A would like to say, oh, you're against, you don't see marriage as sacred. And that's not true. That's a disparaging misrepresentation. Camp B would say, no, we're very committed to marriage as God designed it. And so they would go back to Genesis 2:24, which is the very first commandment in the Bible about marriage. And it says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. So the united into one is they're married. And so what are the requirements? There's nothing in there, they would say, about a marriage ceremony. Rather, they are to leave and they are to join or to cleave to their wife. Two attitudes, two foundational attitudes are all that God says are his requirements for marriage. So what does that mean? Leave. It means you set boundaries with your parents. And you make this person now more important to you than them. Secondly, you are united. You cleave. You form deep, healthy attachment. Now, a lot of people who would have problems with Group A, Camp A, would say, there are so many people that get married by a ceremony, but they've never set boundaries with their parents. They've never attached in healthy ways. So though they're supposedly following God's design by getting married with a ceremony, they're not following God's design because they haven't left their parents and they haven't attached to their spouse. So really, they're breaking God's rules about marriage. And so, let me give you some of the dangers that have been identified by Camp B. Every generation has the tendency to not focus on internal attitudes as much as external actions. And so the focus is you need a marriage ceremony. But as you look at the Bible, the focus of God is always the internal attitudes. When you look at Jesus, his very first sermon in Matthew 5, it's all about internal attitudes. And what God realizes is if your internal attitudes are right, the external actions will take care of themselves. If we put the priority on the external action and lose sight of the internal attitudes, pretty soon we'll have it all backwards and it will get messed up. And so that is what people are saying. That's what's happened with marriage. We have not emphasized the internal attitudes, just the external. And now we are saying you're married in God's eyes because you had a ceremony when really you're not, because you haven't left your parents and you haven't attached to your spouse. Now let me just take this a bit further for complex trauma people. Boundaries with parents, healthy attachment to your spouse. Both of those are not natural to people from complex trauma. And so what that is pointing out is this. For many people from complex trauma, for them to come into marriage, they are set up because of complex trauma to not have healthy boundaries and not be able to attach. So they're set up to fail in marriage. And so if a church comes to them and says, you need a marriage ceremony, but doesn't help them learn how to have healthy boundaries and learn how to attach, the church is setting them up to fail. And so they are endorsing these people. Wow, they're obeying God. They're getting married. But they're endorsing unhealthy people with no tools for relationships that are eventually going to fall apart. And that is, again, to me, a big thing. And so what Camp B would say the emphasis of churches should be is not the marriage ceremony. But it should be, let's learn healthy boundaries. Let's learn healthy attachment. Let's deal with the issues that prevent healthy boundaries and healthy attachment so that you know what committed love looks like, so that you are able to both grow as people. And then, if you have learned that, then it's up to you whether you have a marriage ceremony or not. That's between you and God. We're not going to go there. Now, let me just add this. About 5 years ago, I was doing a lot of thinking in this area. And I was talking to a friend of mine, a pastor friend, and I was talking to him about it. And he sent me an email. And it was about a historian who was doing research on the early church in the area of marriage. And what he found was this. In the early church, they would recognize a person as being married if they had a marriage ceremony publicly, or if they just made a private commitment to each other. They would still consider them married, or if they had lived together for a period of time. And so the early church had a broader understanding of what constitutes marriage than just a marriage ceremony. So that leads to the next one, divorce. And again, this has been a hot button, but there's been a shift over the years between camps within the church. So Camp A would say, no divorce ever. And they would really focus on Malachi 2:16, where God says, I hate divorce. And that would be really kind of what they would drive home repeatedly. Camp B would say, no divorce unless there's cheating, adultery. And they would use Matthew 5. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery. And then Camp C came along and said, okay, no divorce except for adultery and abuse. There's nothing in the Bible particularly about physical abuse, but we know that it's bad. And we want to broaden the divorce allowance criteria to abuse as well. And so that became part of Camp C. Camp D, divorce for hardness of heart. And let me explain this one. So they would use Matthew 19. But let me lead into that. First, they would say, Jeremiah 3, God says, I divorced faithless Israel because of her adultery. So they would say, now, Camp A, you have a problem. God says he hates divorce, but he says he's divorcing Israel. So even though God hates divorce, doesn't mean he never sees it as the right option. So that takes care of that. And then Matthew 19, verse 8 says, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts. But it was not what God had originally intended. And so God's ideal was marriages that lasted. But when Moses saw hardness of heart, then it was allowed for that. So what does it mean by hardness of heart? So I got to give you a little Bible study here. So Matthew 19, the chapter before, Matthew 18, is the context for chapter 19, and it's very significant. It's all about what happens if somebody does something that is very wrong, very hurtful, very unloving. So they're continually cheating, they're continually lying, they're continually doing very hurtful things. So Jesus lays out a pattern that should be followed. So first you go to them privately and you point it out to them and say, I'm concerned about you. This isn't right. Please change. And you hope that the guy or the girl will see it and say, yeah, you're right. I'm going to change my ways. But if they don't and they keep doing it, then it says, step it up to the next level. 2 or 3 people go and meet privately. So now it's not just the one person. Now you're bringing others. Kind of an intervention type thing to really talk to them. If they still don't change, then it says you go to everybody who loves them and knows them and say, please, let's all come and talk to this person. Not to judge them, but out of concern, out of care. And hopefully, after kind of seeing all of this demonstration of love and care, the person will say, okay, I'm going to stop. But then it says, if the person still doesn't change, then you go to the final step and you set a boundary. And you say, you know what? I'm not going to have anything more to do with you here. I'm going to push you out of my life quite a bit. So what is that saying? Jesus is saying you don't set a severe boundary with a person unless you see that they've hardened their heart and they refuse to change behavior that they know is very hurtful and wrong. But you first go through a process, a lengthy process, a careful process, a loving process, giving them chances, and you don't set the severe boundary until it's proven that nothing is working. They've still hardened their heart. They're not willing to change. Okay, so now let's come to chapter 19. Moses' hardness of heart. And so what I think God is saying is this. God knows that if marriage is going to work, you need two people who are both willing to change, who have soft hearts, who are willing to own when they've done wrong and change it. If you only have one person willing to change and the other person is not, they've hardened their heart, that marriage is never going to work, no matter how hard this person tries who is willing to change. And so if you go through a lengthy process with a partner to try and point out where they're doing hurtful, wrong things, and it, after a lengthy period of time, becomes very clear that they are refusing to change, then Moses says, you can get a divorce. That would be okay. And I think that's what that camp is really wanting people to understand. Now, let me go to just a side note with this. Many people who have been living together have been told you're living in sin. You're a sinner. Shame on you. So I want to talk about this sin concept because to me it potentially has done damage. So what they're saying is the definition of sin is when you choose, in light of knowing what you should do, what God says is right, you do something else. You rebel and choose to do something against God. It's a conscious act of rebellion. That's their definition of sin. And let me say this, that is in the Bible. That is one aspect of what sin is. But my concern is there are other aspects, two other aspects of what sin is that are in the Bible. First is, sin is talked about as having unhealthy attitudes or motives. And that's the whole focus of Jesus in Matthew 5. Jesus has said, you have been told that sexual immorality only happens when you cheat on a person. I tell you that it's about an attitude of lust. You've been told that murder only happens when you kill a person. External actions. I tell you, it's an attitude of resentment, holding a grudge. Those are attitude-type sins. And so that has to be factored in. But then there's a third thing, and this is the one that I think has been missed. In Israel's history, back in their early days, they lived with a system of different types of sacrifices that they made regularly. And they had two different sacrifices for sin. So the one sacrifice was for a conscious act of rebellion against God that you were aware of, and now you repent and want to change your ways, and you make a sacrifice. But there was another type of sacrifice for sin, and that was the realization that there's a lot of things that I do that aren't healthy that I'm not even aware of. So if you look at sin this way, not sinning, not missing the mark, and that's all sin means, missing the mark, is living within God's design. What God says is healthy in every area of life. Then you are living a sinless life. Now, the reality is that I don't live 100% healthy in any area of my life. I'm learning all the time. I'm growing all the time. There are areas of my life that aren't as healthy as they could be, but I'm not yet even aware of them. So do you realize what that means? It means that I have never, for a second, been totally within God's design. I'm constantly outside to some degree or another, conscious or unconscious. And so when people get all focused on, oh, you're living together, you're living in sin, what they're not seeing is they're living in sin 24/7 because they're never perfectly healthy. And so that is an important thing to factor in. Okay, let me come to the final one. And this is probably the most volatile one. John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Acts 4:12, Jesus is the one referred to in the scriptures where it says, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. There is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. So Camp A, which would be the evangelical Christianity and other parts of Christianity, which is exclusivism. You have to come to know Jesus personally, trust what he did for you on the cross and by rising again from the dead, and that's how you become a Christian, and that's the only way to get to heaven. So that would be Camp A. But there is starting over the last number of years to be a Camp B, and I want you to be aware of it. And again, it's by very godly people who started with this. Okay, I love Jesus, and I want people to know Jesus. I think he provides the best roadmap of what life should be like. But what about people who've never heard about Jesus? Does that mean they're all going to hell? People in the Amazon rain jungle that have never yet heard about Jesus? Or what about people who were born before Jesus was born? Do they not go to heaven because they didn't know Jesus? So they're starting to just say there might be some loopholes or flaws in this exclusive argument. Thirdly, what about little children and babies? They haven't had a chance to get to know Jesus and to trust him. And then some who work in the field that I work in, of people who have been severely spiritually abused by Christian churches who teach that. They still want a relationship with God, but they're never going back to church. That whole thing to them goes, who wants to put up with all of that crap? I'm going to pursue a relationship with God on my own with some of my friends, but I'm not going back into a church, and I really don't have any use for that. So will God say, well, boy, even though you were spiritually abused, you should have got all that straightened out and gone back there and trusted in Jesus? And some would say, I'm not sure that God would do that. That's just not God's heart. And so what they then say, this camp, is maybe this verse, John 14:6, Acts 14:12, isn't saying that a person has to come to know Jesus, but when Jesus says, I am the way, what he is saying is he's the only one who could deal with the sin problem in the world, could deal with man's separation from God. It's not that they have to come and trust him, it's that he's the only one who could make that right. And so, you can go then beyond that to a person who may never come to know Jesus, but they follow the light that they have in their heart and pursue God and surrender to God to the best of their ability. They would say, we think God would let them into heaven. So they come to a point, not necessarily that they know Jesus, and it's not saying Jesus isn't necessary, but they just don't know about that. But they just follow the light in their heart. And they just say, I want to know this God better. I want a relationship with him. I surrender to him. And that's where they would go. Now, let me just add a side note to this. And I'm saying this not out of any desire to stir up a whole bunch of controversy. But in what I do presentations to pastors and church leaders. And so there's a mindset for a lot of churches and church leaders that goes like this. The priority that Jesus gave us was to go in all the world, make disciples of all nations, preach the gospel. So our job is to convert people to Christianity. Our job is to proselytize. And so what that has become to look like for many churches is you talk to a person, you need Jesus. If you don't, you're going to hell. And so just pray this prayer and have what they call the sinner's prayer that is prayed. And if you pray that, then you can go to heaven. So in other words, you're going to hell. We have fire insurance called Jesus. Just pray this prayer, and that's your fire insurance. And so what can then happen out of that is, if everybody's going to hell, we have to tell them this. We have to grab every opportunity to tell them this stuff, to put pressure on them to trust Jesus. And so in some cases, it goes to what I would say very unhealthy ways. So what would happen in a complex trauma home where the mother or father says to the children, I'm right, you're wrong. You need to know what I know. So I am going to force you to sit in that chair and listen to me go on a long rant that tears you down and shames you and puts pressure on you to agree with me. Over time, as soon as that child heard the parent begin to rant, they would tune them out. And beyond that, they would harden their heart and want to do the exact opposite of what that parent was saying. And so what that parent is doing is saying, because I'm right and I'm above you, I have the right to violate love and to violate healthy boundaries and force something on you, try to control you because I'm right. And that's what's happened for a lot of churches. They do that kind of thing. And what I tell pastors is you are causing the very opposite of what you want. You are working with people with complex trauma, and when they hear you start that pressure tactic and force them, they're going to go the opposite direction. So by trying to evangelize people, you're turning people off. And that to me is a very sad thing. So some of the things that sadly can happen is the captive audience thing. So you're at a wedding or a funeral, and the pastor thinks that, wow, I've got this captive audience. They can't run out the door because it's a wedding or a funeral. So I'm going to preach at them and tell them they need Jesus. Or you have the hidden agenda. I'm going to invite my neighbor to come and see my child's drama at school. And that's what I'm going to say. Just come and enjoy it. But really, I have a hidden agenda. I want to then talk to them about Jesus. And I say, pastors, you are destroying your credibility by having hidden agendas. People with complex trauma have quickly lose respect for people with hidden agendas. And when you try to force stuff, you drive people away. And so if you are in an environment where you're told that, I just leave you that as something to think through. So another way to look at this, and it's kind of a Canadian-American thing, but it's a very important thing, is that when colonial Britain came to Canada, they saw that their role was to bring the Christian values, the Christian message, the Christian culture to these pagans. And so they took children out of homes, put them in residential schools, wouldn't let them speak their own language, wouldn't let them do anything from their culture because it was bad, it was pagan. And they were going to show them a better way because they were right and the natives were wrong. And they set up a system of repression and abuse that has done untold damage. And I deal with it all the time. And so that approach, when taken to the extreme, is colonialism meeting the indigenous world, and it's not a pretty sight. So let me end with this. For many of you, I've just given you way too much to think about. Some of you are starting to feel really nervous about some stuff. But if you have been spiritually abused, I came across this quote: spiritual abuse is sneaky. It hides in the fact that it is not commonly discussed and thus is often overlooked. And that's why we've talked about it. But know that if you have experienced spiritual abuse or oppression, you are not alone. And compassionate help and support can help you overcome its effects. It is a tough journey to get over spiritual abuse. It is difficult to start sorting out what's true, what's a lie. What do I do with God? What do I do with all of this stuff? But if you would make that journey, I think you'll come down the road in that journey and go, I'm glad I took the journey. It has led to a deeper faith. It has led to a deeper spiritual life and connection to God. Let's pray. Father, this is a tough topic, but an important topic. And I just pray for each person who's been listening that you would just help them. If they were trying to sort all of this out in their life, that you would guide them. And for those who maybe have been caught in a system of spiritual abuse and haven't seen it before, that you would help them know what to do. And for those who have been involved in systems where they have been spiritually abusing people and maybe didn't even see it, that you would just help them as well. Amen. Well, thank you again for being part of this Friday that we've shared together. Next week, we're going to do our final talk on this spiritual abuse. I'm going to go in a little different direction that I hope will be very helpful for you. So until then, have a great weekend.